Hello again. Welcome back to Things I Want My Kids to Know with me, Ted Bradshaw. Today, we're going to do all the different ways that I know of to deal with anxious thoughts. For those of you watching, I'm standing up today, and partly that's because my watch has told me to, and partly it's because I'm feeling a bit exhausted, frankly, today. And that's relevant for the topic we're discussing because I woke up in the middle of the night, partly because I couldn't breathe because I got a slight cold. But then once I was awake, I had some stuff running through my mind that I was anxious about, some of which being recording things and getting things done. And so perhaps we will use that as our example of, okay, well, here's some thoughts that were running through my mind. How can you deal with that? What are the different ways in which you can manage those thoughts? Let's crack on with it, shall we? So, first of all, for me, maybe I'll just name what they all are and then we'll go into them in all detail. First thing we're going to talk about is being aware of what your thoughts are in the first place, or even the fact that you are feeling anxious. That, for me, is a foundational thing of dealing with anxious thoughts. You can't deal with your anxiety unless you know that's what you're feeling, unless you've recognised, oh, I'm feeling tense in my chest or my kind of head's buzzing. That's our kind of cue and our clue that something's going on. So awareness, number one, how do you become aware of those things? Taking that a step further, for me, I always think it is valuable to build your awareness about why, about where might this come from when you feel anxious about stuff. Some of it will just be to do with the situation you're in, and anybody would feel anxious. And some of it might also be that the way that you feel is changed or magnified or affected by your previous experiences as well. Some of my rationale for that, about why I think that's helpful, is sometimes it helps you be a bit more forgiving of yourself, and it can help you when you're wanting to not get sucked in so much by those thoughts. If you're able to see, like, oh, okay, this might be the sort of old pattern that my brain tends to throw at me. So once you've become aware, the other things we're going to talk about is one of the first things that people get, I suppose, advised or shown or spoken to about is questioning your thoughts in terms of, like, how true is this thought? Is it fair? Am I being reasonable with myself? How likely is it that this thing I'm afraid of is going to come true, type thing? Which might be the first thing that people learn, and it can be a really useful principle, but sometimes when it's badly used, actually it just makes you feel like you're being an idiot. So we'll come back to that. How helpful is the thought? What's the effect? That can be a way that we can go. Practicing what you would say to a friend is another thing. Using a compassionate tone of voice, a soothing tone of voice, is a huge part. And for me, the final thing we're going to talk about as well is a very different way of dealing with the thoughts, which isn't about fighting them or trying to find a different way of thinking. And it's called diffusion. And we'll talk more about that at the end of this episode, I suppose. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's start with awareness. So as I've said, this is a foundational thing. You can't work with your anxious thoughts. Have a little sip of water. You can't work with your anxious thoughts or do anything about them unless you kind of know what they are. Or, put another way, unless you can recognise that you're anxious in the first place. So, 2 levels to this awareness. One, being aware that you're anxious. So some of that isn't to do with your thoughts at all. It's about what happens to you when you start to become anxious. I think that's quite important because sometimes we wait until it's bad, until we notice it. But if you can get to learn the early signs, it's a little bit easier. So before it's really got itself going, you've gone, oh, okay, I'm feeling a bit tense about something. What's going on here? So if I were to give you a bit of an example then for what was going on for me at 4 a.m. this morning. Basically, the thing that was on my mind is somebody had tagged me in something online where they were sort of raising some really sort of useful and valid points about CBT and the kind of limitations. In a way, exactly this. And I'd been pondering, like, how would I respond? But I always find it really hard to respond in a comment, so in like a written format that has to be quite short, about any of the stuff that I talk about. It's one of the things that stresses me out sometimes about what I do, is sometimes people ask questions and I want to be able to answer them, but it can take me like an hour or more to respond to a simple question because they're not simple. They're just not. That's part of the reason I'm doing this podcast. So part of what was in my head was, how would I respond to this person? So that might be the sort of surface level thought. So how do we generate awareness? One of the first things we do is I would encourage people to practice noticing when you're anxious and starting to write something down. I've actually got it next to me. So I've got a little pad next to me that I tend to use these days. And I will write down, where am I, what's going on, what am I feeling, and what's going through my head. So ways in to understand what the thoughts are is, first of all, what's going through your head. So I would write down, it's 4 a.m. In the morning, I've woken up because I can't breathe, and I'm starting to think about this comment and how I would respond to it, how I would address it, how I would reply. So that's what we've got out on the table so far. However, that's not really enough for my body to be setting off this physical reaction, this chain reaction in my body that is there for dealing with tigers and stuff. So when you feel anxious, when you feel that tightness in your chest or the sort of fuzz in your head or the sort of knot in your stomach, even if it's low level, that is your body's fight or flight response. It is there to get you to respond to possible danger. And so far in I am thinking about this comment, I don't see any danger yet. So one of the things we're looking for is kind of where's the tiger? So it's helpful to understand that there are three main things that will trigger your fight or flight response. One is if your brain has spotted some risk of harm to yourself or the people that you love. So when we're thinking about illnesses or burglary or worrying about health, things like that, that makes sense. Resources, so worrying about money, worrying about whether you're going to be sort of safe and have shelter, those things are absolutely huge, which is sometimes why we get very stressed about work. We have a tiger-based reaction about sending emails. That can be how you can understand it, like what if I lose my job? And social. So as we grow, we're all chimpanzees fundamentally. We need a place in the group. And if there's part of me that has learned that I have to be perfect, or I have to be responsible, or I have to keep everybody happy, sometimes what your brain will be firing at you is what if you let that down? So social, or a fear of rejection as well. So bearing that in mind, when I ask myself, well, what is it? So this is a useful question to ask yourself. Where am I? What's going on? How am I feeling? What's going through my head? To ask yourself, what is it about this that's making you feel anxious? And my answer to that, I suppose, would be, I can't quite explain it immediately, but it's something about, like, what if I express it in a way that gets misinterpreted and people don't like, and I either upset somebody or offend someone, or what if there's somebody kind of unreasonable who comes charging in and sort of has a go at me, and that makes me uncomfortable. So it's that sort of social fear. Fundamentally, I can ask that question again. I've got closer to it. So it sounds like what you're afraid of is somebody misinterpreting or getting upset with you or having a go at you. Is that right? Yes, that's right. Okay, what is it about that makes you feel anxious? I don't know, it just makes me feel sick. I don't know if I can cope with it. That's really helpful. So I'm sitting here worried. It's not the comment necessarily itself, it's what the consequences could be. That's my understanding. And the more you can practice looking at your awareness, the more you will start noticing themes. So if you practice this for a few weeks, you'll notice that there will be themes that it might come up about lots of different things, but fundamentally it's about responsibility, or I keep worrying about like what if there's harm to me or my people that I love, or what if I miss out on things, or I keep worrying about failing or letting people down. Those give you your themes. And what that allows you to do is to have a little shortcut. So eventually you get to a point when you're anxious, you go, what am I anxious about? And it's a little bit easier to say, I know exactly what I'm anxious about. It's the same thing as it was 2 weeks ago. It's the same thing. It's that same theme again, which gives you a little bit of a shortcut. The next kind of level to that, which I think can be helpful, is also to think about where that might come from. So If you find, like me, that it's mostly about rejection, why might you be slightly more likely to worry about rejection than perhaps somebody else? Or why do you worry about this more than you worry about other things? Typically speaking, you're more likely to worry about being rejected if you've been rejected before, or worry about being laughed at if you've been laughed at before. You're more likely to worry about illness if you have seen that can happen in any way. Or you're more likely to feel responsible for everybody if those are the messages you were given as you grew up, that kind of thing. There's more to say on that, but for me, that's worth it sometimes because you can be a little bit more forgiving to yourself. All right, one more pause while I have a little wipe on my nose. This thing that's woken me up in the middle of the night, marvellous. Oh yeah, there we go. So, I bet you wanted to hear and see that, didn't you? Next up, what do I do with them? I have identified what they are. What do I do with them? Sometimes when you become more aware of it, the first thing that happens is it's kind of annoying. Because, all right, I can see why I get anxious. I can see what's happening in my head, but I can't change it, can't divert it. What do I do? One of the first things that you might have come across is, and one of the main things that people get taught in CBT, the first bit when people get taught a bit of CBT, is questioning thoughts, challenging thoughts by asking, how true is it and what evidence do I have? Now, I want to be really clear that there is some value to this, but in some situations it is wildly inappropriate. So let's use this as an example. So if I were to ask myself, okay, so I identified that the thing I'm afraid of is that I'm going to write a response to this and that somebody will have a problem with it or I might accidentally offend somebody. How true is that if you write this, it is likely to offend somebody or somebody might come and have a go at you? You already see the limitations of this, right? Because part of me can go, well, I have had people be really unreasonable with me online. So it does feel like there is a great possibility. And you're talking about sensitive things and people have strong feelings about it. Of course they do. So it is possible. So that doesn't really do anything about my anxiety. And there are some situations where, for example, if you're worried about the safety of somebody that you love, or you're worried about your job and the security of your job, and the reality is that, there are redundancies or something. How true is it that I might lose my job? Well, it feels quite true. So therein lies the problem. It is useful to know that your thoughts aren't always 100% truthful, if you like. So it is really helpful for me to know that I tend to feel a magnified fear about people not liking me or about offending someone because of my history. It is helpful for me to know that. So sometimes what that lets me do is go, okay, I can see that I'm maybe overestimating the likelihood of it or how bad it would be. But that doesn't mean it's not true. How true is maybe more helpful. So when I'm really anxious, it feels like it's 100% it's going to happen. Whereas when I ask myself, how true is it? Is this definitely going to happen? I might say, well, no, actually. I'm quite good at writing things in a way that I'm comfortable with and that I'm okay with, and that shouldn't ruffle feathers, if you like, because I'm not being harsh or cruel and I'm being very understanding. So actually, yeah, there is a chance, but maybe it's a small chance. Maybe it's a 10% chance. And that does help. That does help me feel a little bit different about it. So yes, this is one option. Once you've identified what you are afraid of or what the thoughts are, is how true? How true is that? How likely is it? But again, I will reiterate, there's limits to how helpful that is. And you should never ever use it on situations where it's not so much your thinking, it's just the situation. So sometimes we feel anxious not because of our thoughts completely, but just because the situation is hard. If your job is under threat, you're not being weird for worrying about that. And I would argue you're never being weird. I don't think I'm being weird for worrying about people having a problem with what I've got to say or people not liking me. I think it's reasonable. And once I understand my experiences, it's even more understandable. None of this works. None of the things I'm going to tell you work unless it starts with kindness and validation first. So when you are working with your thoughts, first of all, ask yourself, if I was going to be reasonable with myself about this, how would I kind of be kind to myself about it? That would be number one. Before you then go, okay, well, now I've established that it's kind of reasonable that you'd be worried about it. Let's talk about, well, it seems like it's very likely or very true that this is going to happen. Let's look at that. How true? Then you'll be more likely to get somewhere. That, I think, is most of why people get stuck. You have to start with validating your thoughts. Hopefully the same way you would with everybody else. If a child is afraid, if we go straight in with, stop it, stop being afraid, there's nothing to worry about, it tends not to make it go away. Whereas if we go, look, I understand. I do get why you'd be afraid. And here's some useful ways of us looking at this situation. We just get so much further. So that's how true. How helpful is useful. So if I were to ask myself about these thoughts, what's the effect of thinking to yourself and of being convinced, or of being so focused upon not wanting to cause any offence or make anybody not like you, or cause somebody to come out of the woodwork and come in on you two-footed type thing? And I would say it's stressful. It's stressful. And sometimes it means that I'm focused more on being cautious than I am on truly expressing something that I think would be useful. Sometimes I hold back, or I just don't reply. Frankly, some of the effect, how helpful, is that I just don't reply to people because I'm too worried about, if I do reply, that I'll say something wrong. So what's the effect of thinking this way? Or sometimes it gets in my way. And there's something powerful in being able to ask that question, because it doesn't assume that you shouldn't. It doesn't assume that you should be able to get rid of this feeling or stop thinking this way. But what it's asking is, when you're fully immersed in that way of thinking, what's the effect? And in addition, what would you like to be able to think or feel about this situation instead? That can be some really helpful questions to ask yourself. And what my answer to that would be, I'd like to be able to be sensitive and cautious and reasonable, but less focused on what could go wrong and more focused on what could go right. As in, I want to reply in order to be helpful. And if I could focus on, here's the most helpful things to say, and less focused on how might people misinterpret that, then that would free me up and allow me to reply to stuff. So how helpful, and what is it you like to be able to think instead? The next one I want to introduce to you is, what would I say to a friend? So this one is a way of accessing the kindness that we reserve for everybody else. So if I was to ask myself, what would I say to a friend? So if there's a friend of yours, Ted, who was trying to do these things and was feeling really nervous about it, and thinking to themselves, what if somebody has a problem with what I'm saying? What would you say? And off the top of my head, I think I would say something like, it is okay to be anxious about this. What you're trying to do a good thing, and it's okay to be nervous. It is horrible, the idea that somebody could be really nasty. I don't have a simple solution, but I do know this is important to you. And if it's important to you, it would be a shame. It would be a shame for this to stop you. But it is reasonable that you feel it. That's what I would say. We can usually see things for other people that we can't quite see for ourselves. That is if you take anything away from this one, it would probably be that one, I would say. What would I say to a friend? But another aspect to that, so not only what would I say, is the tone of voice. This brings us into what to do with anxious thoughts, is not only to do with kind of arguing with the thoughts or finding a new sort of set of sentences to say in your head. Sometimes it's as simple as dealing with yourself with a soothing tone. And this is really effective for me. This really helped me this morning at about 4:30 when it was still going. Was I could see what I would say to a friend. So let's try that again, but with even more. I'm going to dial up the compassionate tone. I'm going to imagine I was speaking to one of my kids. I would say it something like, I totally get why you'd be anxious. Just a little sidebar. I can feel myself about to say something very, very kind to myself, and then immediately wanting to back away from that. But I'm not going to. So let's stick with this. I think it's a good thing what you're doing. I think it's a brave thing. It is brave to put things out there knowing that that could cause you some distress in some way, but wanting to do that because it's a good thing. That's a brave thing to do. It is a shame that some of your previous experiences of not being treated fairly are getting in the way of that, or affecting the way that you feel. But it is completely reasonable that you are bothered by that. It is okay to be anxious. I think it would be good for you to do it anyway. And I think as much as it's reasonable to be worried about the things that could go wrong, I think it would probably be helpful to focus as well on the things that have gone right. You get so many lovely interactions with and from people, and it might be helpful to focus more on those. That's what I'd say. That's what I mean by the tone. I feel more different kind of in my chest as a result of the tone than I do of the words, I think. So using a calm and compassionate tone, practicing what you would use, speaking to yourself in the way that you would speak to somebody else, somebody you love. And finally, the final thing we're going to talk about is diffusion. So I really like this one. This comes from a branch of CBT called acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's all about recognizing that there are thoughts and just trying not to get swept away by them. So detaching yourself from your thought. This is a thought I'm having. It's not me and it's not the truth. Some of the ways you can do that is there's quite a structured way of doing that, which is just labeling your thoughts as thoughts. So when you notice you're having a thought, you say, I am having a thought. So in my case, it would be, I'm having a thought that people aren't going to like me and it's going to go really badly. And what that does is it just puts a little bit of distance between me and the thought, so I can see it. The ACT folk tend to talk about watching sort of thoughts as if they're cars going by on a roundabout. You can see them, you can watch them, you don't have to flag them down and get in. And that's what we're aiming for, so they're not so dominant. But there are other ways of doing this as well, one of which is to turn it into a different voice. So one of my favourite ways of doing that, my go-to is Darth Vader. So it tends to go something like this.
Ted, what are you doing? Why do you keep putting yourself in these situations? Nobody wants to hear what you have to say.
That kind of thing. So it is the thoughts that are going through my head. It is the deepest, darkest, scariest thoughts, but they don't feel so heavy anymore. They feel like, oh, okay, I can see what you are. You're just thoughts. And it's a lot easier to not get dragged into them, sucked into them and swept away by them. We can also do it by singing. So singing the worst thoughts. So my go-to is singing, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, why don't I go and eat worms? I have no idea where that came from. Somebody sang it at primary school, I think, and it's stuck in my head. But again, that's generally the theme of what I'm worrying about. So when I recognise that's really getting on top of me, sometimes I will sing that song because it allows me to say, I can see what's happening. This noise in my head is saying this stuff. And then the final way of diffusing, which I quite like, is imagery. So particularly, I like to picture anxious Ted, Professor Ted, who's like the sort of rational part of my brain, if you like, and Dad Ted, who is kind of the compassionate part of me. And what that allows me to do is allows me to say, okay, what's anxious Ted saying? And anxious Ted is going, oh my Lord, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep putting yourself in these situations? What's wrong with you? The kind of thing. I say, okay, what about Professor Ted? So Professor Ted, when anxious Ted is talking, he's annoyed. So he sort of looks over at anxious Ted and he goes, oh, are we doing this again? Do you really need to be this anxious? Come on, can't you just be logical? So while he is trying to say we don't need to worry, he's not really saying it in a very helpful way, which is exactly what happens in my head. But when I want to be able to access that compassionate tone that I was talking about, sometimes what I'll ask myself is, what about Dad Ted? What would he say? And he's just sort of an image of me as a dad, I suppose. There's a particular video of me playing with my eldest when she was small, and I'm wearing like a red t-shirt and blue jeans, and I picture this guy. And when I say, well, what would he say when anxious Ted is anxious? The answer I get is that he might not say anything. First of all, he might just go over to him and put an arm around him. And then he might say, it's all right. I know you're scared, but it is going to be okay. You're not on your own. That, for me, is a very effective way of me dealing with those moments of anxiety. Not arguing with, wrestling with, debating my thoughts, but just recognizing that they are there and finding a way of accessing that compassionate way of looking at things too. I hope you found this helpful. I am going to be running a course on anxiety later in June 2026, so I'll put the details of that in the show description, in the show notes. But thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.